All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip. And today on the podcast and on the live stream, I'm joined again by Leah Schade, who is a reverend and a doctor and in the classroom working with future pulpit occupiers and has written on it. And one of the perks, you'd say, of having regular email contact with thousands of clergy, or you get their questions. And the volume of questions I've received recently that have something like a WTF when it goes to preaching about the justice and compassion of God in our current political context is, well, rather significant. And there's really only one person who I have an email of that's written multiple books on it. So thank you for being back on the podcast, Leah.
Thanks so much, Trip. It is great to be back here on Homebrewed Christianity.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm excited. So maybe you want to say something up front just about the new book. And then I got some questions that come out of it. And I've tried to pull in a number of questions that different clergy have sent in. So, I'm outsourcing them to you.
Okay, sounds good. Well, the book is called Preaching and Social Issues, Tools and Tactics for Empowering Your Prophetic Voice. And it is a sort of follow-up to a book that I wrote in 2019 called Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry and the Red-Blue Divide. And the reason I wrote the follow-up, Preaching and Social Issues, is because as I was surveying thousands of clergy about what it's like to preach about social issues over the last 6 or 7 years, as I've been teaching my students about this, as I've been working with clergy groups, I've been finding that there are a lot of factors that impact their comfort level, their feeling equipped, and their courage in addressing the issues that are affecting their communities, their congregations, and the nation. And so Preaching and Social Issues provides a not just theoretical grounding, but really practical tools, including an assessment tool to help preachers gauge their personal vulnerabilities and strengths, the vulnerabilities and strengths in their congregation, and the relationships within the congregation and the pastor, in order to figure out whether they should take what I call a gentle, invitational, or robust approach to preaching and social issues.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say the book is like pragmatic in a rather aggressive way, right? It's not built for someone who has to decide whether God cares about the planet or the poor or just, it's someone who does, who is then going like, what does responsibility look like when you have the vocation of the preaching task? You're gifted because of employment, the time to wrestle with the text and get to know your community, not just the community you serve, but the larger community your church is connected to.
Right.
What does it mean to honor the word and the context and the people and where they are? And that is a uniquely sticky wicket in a mainline Protestant congregations, because despite the clergy themselves skewing much more progressive than your average educated white person in America, the congregations are very mixed.
Yes.
Even United Methodist after the separation, it had over 50% of its congregants voting for Donald Trump. And then the denominations you think of as really progressive, like the UCC or the Episcopal Church, they still are going to have 35 to 42% of their congregants still voting Republican. And I'm sure you've had this experience if you only hang out with clergy of those denominations, the ones that show up in our classes and stuff. That is not the ratio. That's just
Right.
not the leadership of the churches and denominations. And so I wonder, as someone who's worked with so many people, both preparing them for that context and then in DMin context or in ongoing relationship with students, what are some ways of just starting to make sense of that dichotomy? Because we don't get to pick where we're called all the time, and there's that pulling of your own integrity and then the integrity to the vocation.
That's a really good way to describe it, Trip. One of the things that I advise all clergy to do is to learn how to listen deeply to the values that are undergirding whatever position their congregant seems to be taking. Um, Jonathan Haidt wrote a great book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree About Religion and Politics. And he lays out 6 moral frameworks that people use to determine what is right. Um, Things like care versus harm, freedom versus oppression, sanctity versus degradation. So there's 6 of them. And I talk about this in the book. And when we listen to people who are talking about social issues that seem to be um, really going against maybe what our own personal orientation to politics is, if we can say, okay, I don't agree with this, but what I hear is maybe the value of loyalty to the country, so like patriotism, or fairness. When somebody says it's not right that those people are coming across the border and taking our jobs, so instead of just saying, like, coming at them with facts to dispute that, which is what we really want to do, is just to pause and say, it sounds to me like fairness is really important to you. And when we pause and name that value, we're humanizing the person. We're saying that, okay, I may disagree with where you're coming from, but I can at least identify what is the moral framework that you're using here. And it also helps to lower the temperature if somebody is saying something like this and they hear that you are accurately describing back to them where they're coming from, they're more likely to say, okay, yeah, that is what's important to me. And then you can ask, would you like to hear where I'm coming from on this? They're going to be more open to hearing where you're coming from. And then you can start going into some of the biblical and theological and ethical values that undergird our positions, and start to have a dialogue instead of a diatribe.
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is helpful to really talk about up front is that the fear clergy have around this is real.
Yes.
And think of, like, there are stories you I mean, I've heard stories, but in the book, there you've told stories where a lot of clergy are really scared for real reasons, right? Like
Mhm.
being doxxed or churches being vandalized, bomb threats, these kinds of things. So knowing how the just web of relations of clergy works, like, what's your first word to a pastor who genuinely feels that speaking up from the pulpit puts them at risk? And because that part is something maybe the lay people that are listening may not know. When you're showing up in the office going, Reverend, don't you think you should be really clear on this?
Mm. If a pastor wants to preach about a social issue that could be controversial in their congregation, what I recommend is to, first of all, have some conversation before launching into the sermon. Um, Talk with some trusted leaders to say, this is something that I'm feeling very called to address publicly in the pulpit, but I know that it could cause some people to respond in a hostile way, either in our congregation, or say if we live stream our services and people can pick that up publicly, or if we're really out there that, we're, say, open and affirming about accepting people of all sexual orientations and gender identities, and we're public about this. Does it make our congregation a target for right-wing extremist groups that might want to come after us as a way to raise their own profile, and thus put our congregation in danger? Um, or if we're taking a stand on being a sanctuary church for those in our country who do not have citizenship yet, does that make us a target for ICE? And how do we put protections in place for the people that we're serving, either through through our food services or through our after school programs? How do we put protections in place ahead of time so that we're ready? We feel confident that we've got a protocol to follow, And we know how to respond not out of panic, but with, we've really thought this through. And there's an organization that I co-founded called the Clergy Emergency League. And this is a network of pastors that have been talking together about how to do this kind of work since 2020. And we've got some great resources to help pastors and congregations think about what are the things we need to put in place now, so that we're networked with other congregations who are doing this work, with other organizations in the community, and that we can have each other's backs, support each other, and have the sermon and the preaching be homiletical accompaniment for this, rather than just a lightning rod and bringing that really aggressive energy to the church that we're not prepared for.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I got a couple questions from clergy around the fear element and theme you bring up in the book. Dana, who Midwest Methodist clergy, said, honestly, some Sundays I wake up and I don't know if I have it in me. The news is brutal. My congregation is fragile, and I'm supposed to stand up there and say something true. How do you keep going when it feels like too much? And
Mm,
I appreciate her being that vulnerable and sending it in so we can use it here, because I think a lot of lay people don't know that this is what's going underneath a lot of us when we're
yeah,
thinking
yeah,
all week long on how to honor that space and the trust they have and our commitment to the gospel.
yeah. Um, I think we have to name in this that there is a lot of moral trauma going on right now, so that even if your community is not affected per se by the policy decisions that have been made by this administration, because we're so exposed to what's going on in the news and social media, this this really affects clergy. We tend to be empathetic people. That's what makes us good with pastoral care. And so when we hear about the ways in which people are harmed, and oppressed and literally killed in our streets, this has a terrible effect on us. And we're trying to wrestle with, how do I say this in a way that is biblical and theological, and attending to the pastoral needs of my congregation and my community, at the same time knowing that I am one human being with limits on my emotional resources. And when I've reached that limit, how do I take care of myself, take care of my congregation, while still being true to my call to speak the truth, and preach prophetically, preach the gospel? So, one of the things that I recommend for clergy is to, first of all, uh, find a group of other clergy who can support you in this. It is really important that you not do this work alone. One of the things that we do in the Clergy Emergency League is we have a weekly text study for the Revised Common Lectionary, and pastors come on there, and we don't need to convince each other that the Word of God applies to these social issues. We're thinking about, how can we do this? How can we do this with integrity while also thinking about our own vulnerabilities? And the other thing that I found through the research that I've been doing with these surveys is that pastors who feel that they have support systems, either with fellow clergy, with other community leaders, with a mentor, or with a supportive group within the church, feel much more, their stress levels are less, their resiliency is higher, their energy level is higher. And on those Sundays when they feel like, I just can't do this, they can give themselves grace to say, okay, maybe not this Sunday, maybe I need to dial it back a little bit. And but there's always next Sunday. There's always the opportunity for you to preach a sermon that speaks the truth of God's word, speaks truth to power, and is a word of hope for the most vulnerable among us. If it's not this Sunday, be thinking ahead. Okay, I want to be able to do this. How can I do this going forward? And I've got
Mhm.
ideas in the church how you might take a gentle approach to this while still taking a step forward in this. So there are ways. It's not a all or nothing. There's a spectrum of ways that we can be engaged in this work.
Yeah. Okay, so here's an argument that I hear constantly from clergy who may not even get up to, a really slow movement. They say, "Look, I'm preaching and trying to protect the unity of the congregation." And that desire for unity, the unity trap in the fragile congregation that you describe in the book, it's something you push back hard to. So what's wrong with that framing, and what does unity actually cost if the price is silence?
Yeah, that's a great question, Trip. What I've found is that unity is usually a code word for lack of conflict. And there is a sort of mythological idea that we're all family. We use that term a lot. We're family in the church. And so we should all get along and we shouldn't say things that are going to upset people. Um, and though on us on one level, that's true. If you're upsetting people to the point that they don't want to serve on altar guild anymore, whether it's you as the pastor or the lay leaders who are saying, I need to speak really um, pointedly about this, and it drives such wedges in that people can't be in relationship with each other, then that it's not about threatening the unity of the church, it's threatening the relationships of the church. So we do want to try to maintain the relationships, but I want to be really clear that relationships with people in the church um, have to be seen in context of those most vulnerable, who if our neighbor in the church is saying really harmful things and we're letting that slide, then those who are being harmed by that, even if we can't see them, if they're our neighbors beyond the church walls, then we have done a disservice to the gospel. So what I say to my students is, um, we welcome all people, but we do not welcome all behaviors, and we do not welcome all speech. Hate speech is not something that we welcome here. It is not consistent with the word of God. It is not consistent with the gospel. And so we're going to have a serious conversation about what it means to be in the church, be part of the community, but also have our attitudes, our behaviors um, align with the, the the character of God, which is about grace and truth and justice and forgiveness and welcoming of those who are oppressed. So when we have those kinds of conversations, again, we can't do them by ourselves. We have to do this as a community to say, this is about our identity as the body of Christ, about who we are. Yes, we are a body, but if there are things that the body does that are actually toxic to its existence, then those things are not things we cannot abide that.
Before we go on, could you just give a definition of what you and the clergy that you've surveyed and interacting with mean when they say prophetically, preaching prophetically?
Yeah.
And because, I mean, is it a mode? Is it an orientation? Is it in contrast to being pastoral? Do you switch between them? Like, for those that may not know what's loaded in that word, how is it often used in your context?
There is sometimes a misconception that there's a difference between being pastoral and prophetic. So prophetic sometimes carries the image of, like, John the Baptist or some of the Hebrew prophets that were very strident and kind of finger wagging and in your face and like no holds barred. I'm saying it, and we let the chips fall as they may. And that is one type of prophetic preaching. But there's a much broader context of what it means to be prophetic, and that um, and it Dale Andrews, who the late Dale Andrews, who was a professor of homiletics at Vanderbilt, said that prophetic preaching and pastoral preaching are actually two sides of the same coin. So the things that are affecting my congregation, whether it's economics or the opioid crisis or ICE raids or whatever, I'm addressing those because I'm a pastor and I care about how they're affecting the people in my community. That is a pastoral response. And so when I say these things, when I name them out loud, when the system would prefer me to be silent about it because silence communicates complicity or acceptance, if I say something rather than nothing, that is prophetic in and of itself. The degree to which you say it, the tone, so what you were talking about, Trip, like the tone that you take, all of those things are the modes that you can decide depending on what your congregation is used to, their history with prophetic preaching, what the particular topic is, whether it's a hot, warm, or cool topic, whether it's the first time, whether this is an ongoing thing. All of those things you can be thinking about in terms of the spectrum of prophetic preaching. But it really shouldn't be an option of whether or not we do it. It should be how we do it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is that helpful? Does that
No, no, no,
clarify?
no. It is, and you one of the elements of it that uh, that I found helpful just in congregations where, you know, not someone trying to sneak attack you or whatever, but someone who is very different on certain political issues than I am. As even in a large UCC church in LA, like, 25% or so of the congregation were much more conservative than the staff, and those that volunteer to be on leadership and things. And so part of it is that I found is it's helpful to differentiate when someone comes to you, like the thing is rarely the thing, right? They
Yes.
like oft if you're the minority position in a congregation on whatever the issue is,
Mm-hmm.
and you vocalize criticism or concern, um, realizing that it's often that they understood exactly what you were saying and then want to know, do I still belong? Right.
Mm,
Um,
mm, mm.
and so there's two different elements of that that's really important. Is it to see like the criticism or concern they're having is really a form of pursuit. Like, are you still my pastor? Am I still, like, do I still belong? Do I matter? Um,
Mm.
and, um, and one of the ways that is, rather helpful at addressing it is to point out that the gospel is structurally prophetic, right? Like
Yes.
whatever is already the case is not the kingdom of God. And that gap is what we confess and hope to grow towards, right? Like this, we do it in the Lord's Prayer. There's a reason at the beginning of worship, after we acknowledge the presence and awe and wonder of God, we immediately confess our sins. And it's like the only time everyone in the room knows they're saying the truth is that we're broken,
Mm.
right?
Wow.
And so like if we part of, I think, creating a context of hearing it is like recognizing that oftentimes criticism is a form of pursuit, and the way we prepare people for that is being clear enough in our confessions that no one is left behind in the need to do it, and we're all invited to join God in working towards the salvation of the world. And or if you're Lutheran, it's an idolatry issue, right? Like the if you think it's personal at the recognition of sin, then there's a God problem. So like there's the specific instances of those interactions that lead to that fear and trepidation. I think are we can work on addressing them in other contexts so that the affirmation of the gospel and of the community for those that are gathered is something that's not in jeopardy, right? And it's something we obviously know as parents, right? Like there is an instructive and critical element of helping someone come to themselves, and we know as their parent, like you don't even have it in you to make not love you. So uh, they're kind of
Yeah,
both there.
and I would say one of the ways to get at that is when somebody comes to you in that pursuit is to ask questions and listen to people's stories. So questions like, can you share with me how you came to think this way, and like what's informing your position, and can you tell me a story of how this has affected your life? And I remember one time I was pastoring in a church where at the time, this was when the Muslim ban was happening, and there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment being vocalized by members of my congregation who I loved. I mean, I loved these people. And yet the things that they were saying were abhorrent to me personally. They were not consistent with, how we are to comport ourselves. Um, and I thought that there might be a way to move the needle a little bit. So I had some choices. I could have like come gangbusters in a sermon and like really like called it out and named it, and that would have shamed them, and then that would not have gone anywhere. Um, so instead, I did some individual conversations, and I remember sharing with one gentleman, like we had a conversation, like he was saying certain things that were really negative stereotypes, and I was like, so tell me what Muslims you know that have have exhibited this behavior. And he's like, well, I don't actually know of them. I was like, oh, you know what we should do? There actually is a Muslim community here. What would you think if we did like a series on let's get to know our neighbors in faith? And he was like, well, yeah, I guess yes, we could do that. So it ended up being like a series that we did. We brought in a rabbi and an imam and somebody from, like five different faiths. So when the person from the Muslim faith came and talked about it, and like just dispelled a lot of myths, but it was just a great conversation. A couple weeks later, this guy in my congregation came up to me and he said, Pastor, I saw a woman with a head covering in the line at the grocery store, and I started a conversation with her, and she was really nice. I was like, good for you. That is great, right? So I had choices on how I was going to do this, and I tried to keep hearing his story, hearing other stories, being expansive, being invitational. And then when I preached a sermon on it, I knew people were already wrestling on certain things and I could name those, but do it in a way that's like, we're all on the road for this together. None of us is at the final, we're not finished yet. God is not finished with us yet, and then pointing out biblical examples of people who were changed, who changed their mind, who thought one way and pivoted, and to say, we're all being worked on here by God. And I'm really interested to see what God does with us next.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, the most like practical part of the book is the assessment tool in which you kind of help pastors figure out the capacity of their congregation as it is to receive prophetic sermons and what tone, and getting to know the congregation, which you emphasize, right? Like getting to know who you're talking to is an actual important part of communicating truth, not it's not just a strategic strategy. It's like how you honor the other is
Right.
getting to know them.
Yes.
um and with the assessment tool, you kind of organize the whole practical part of the book around the three different approaches you mentioned of gentle, invitational, and robust. um it's hard to discuss a tool and things, but I'd love for you to kind of uh, give us like what was the origin of
Hmm.
developing the tool and the way you develop those three approaches.
Hmm.
And it should lure people
Yeah. Yeah.
to go get the book.
Well, as I mentioned, my team and I, Amanda Wilson Harper and Wayne Thompson, who are great researchers who've been working with me, we have been surveying pastors and congregations on ministry, preaching, and social issues since 2017. So we have a ton of data about what are the characteristics of pastors that seem to be more hesitant, those who seem to be more willing to do this, and what are the congregational characteristics, and And so we took that data and we turned it into this assessment tool where we ask, you know, what is your gender? And we weight certain things. Like if you are a female in the pulpit, you just automatically, because of the way our society assigns authority to women in authority, you get less points than a male preacher, simply because that's the way our society is. It's not a judgment on you per se. It's just the reality. Um, if you are a a preacher, um, who is in a historically marginalized racial group, and you're in a white congregation, that makes you more vulnerable. So the points reflect that as well. If you're in a congregation that has just come off of a really difficult conflict, the capacity to deal with other issues of conflict is going to be lower. But if you're a church that's like, we've been doing this sort of thing for years, then your capacity is going to be higher. So the weights of how people respond to this are all factored into that. And then it gives you a recommendation of whether you should take an invitational or a gentle, invitational, or robust approach. And then in the book, I offer 3 different strategies, different sermon strategies within those 3 categories. So there's like 9 different ways you could go about doing this. So lots of different entry points. And they're not judgment calls like if everybody should be working towards robust. No. That's just where you are on this particular subject, on this particular at this particular time. Things shift over time. You shift, you change. It's you could take the assessment tool 1 year, take it again, and you might see some things shift. So it is just a way to help preachers have a starting point and then look at, oh yeah, this would really work for if I want to do a sermon on this particular topic. So they're not it's not all written in stone. These are tools that you might pick for one sermon, not use for another, might pick for a particular congregation, not use for another. It's supposed to be adaptable and contextual.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I noticed reading it is, you can assess assessment tools by thinking back to when you wish you had had one, right? Where it's like, Trip makes major fail, inserts during the Obama administration, confessing our tax money being used for drones that just killed a U.S. citizen. Anyway, and was I conscious that the vice president of Raytheon was in the congregation and could be experienced as naming one person among all others? I didn't think about that part. Like, and I like reading, going like, oh, like I could have changed very little, and it would have intentionally
Yes.
created the spaciousness that it didn't feel personal, right? And like
Wow.
just running through the assessment questions, or other times where I go, oh, I think I totally talked myself into wussing out. Or like
Yeah.
we're like thinking it through, like I'm like, oh, I really hope I don't want to make it an uncomfortable staff meeting when the other preachers look at me. So I just say, like, that was one of the things I really enjoyed about it. And here's a question that came in. Maybe you can kind of maybe demonstrate from people, like, kind of how the tools could help. Kevin said, I tell myself I'm being pastoral when I soften a message or pick a gentler angle, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just being a coward.
Mm.
How do I tell the difference between wisdom and avoidance? And why I love that question is, like, realizing that if I had used what the kind of wisdom that's in the assessment, I would have actually, like, used my real love and knowledge of the congregation and kind of externalized it so I could actually frame what's going on
Mm.
well, as
Mm.
opposed to all the fear, insecurity, and then things creeping up in the gaps.
Yeah. One of the things that I recommend to pastors that maybe want to move beyond the gentler angle um, is to reveal some vulnerability in the sermon itself and to name what it is about the issue that they're uncomfortable with, and yet they feel called to address. Like, just be honest, like, just put it out there. So let's not make assumptions about how people are going to respond, but just to say, these are the questions that are coming up for me. Maybe they are for you too. Maybe this is all new for you, but I want you to know that as somebody who, like, it's my job to be your resident biblical scholar and resident theologian, and I am bombarded with the headlines the same way that you are. These are the things I'm wrestling with. And just name the questions and bring it. I mean, you just can't go wrong with doing your exegesis and finding the resonance between what was going on in the background for the biblical writer and their community that was also wrestling with a really difficult issue, and to say they didn't have it all figured out either. And they got a lot of things wrong. I mean, one of the great things about the Bible is that it does not censor the mistakes. It does not
It
show,
chronicles them.
it chronicles them literally, yes, like ad nauseum. But to say they kept discerning, they kept messing up, they were still in relationship, God was still working on them. So and to say Jesus was really concerned about the social issues of his time. So if the Bible models this for us, I think we're ready. I think we can have these conversations too. And I'm not going to be able to, sum it all up in a sermon. I don't have all the answers, but I'm really interested in the questions. And I would really love for us to be talking about this as a church. Sometimes a sermon just needs to give permission to have the conversation,
Yeah.
and then to offer that, that spaciousness that you're talking about. Say, let's grapple with this, and then to do this homiletical accompaniment that these sermons are preaching along the way, to say, here's what I'm hearing. John McClure's The Roundtable Pulpit is really helpful for giving some rhetorical strategies that reflect what a community is discerning about scripture as they go. So if we can think of this as a process rather as I preached my sermon on climate change, I'm checking that off the list, and whether they got it or not, I don't care. As long as I mentioned it, I'm good. Let's go a little deeper here.
Yeah. So you in the book where you're talking about the invitational approach, you discuss the sermon dialogue sermon method, and I think that's like a genuinely different way of thinking about what a Sunday morning can be. It puts it in a broader context. It assumes the continuity and care of
Mhm.
congregational life. So, what does that actually look like, and what does it do that a single sermon can't, with all the expectation and pressure falling on the single moment?
Right. The sermon dialogue sermon process was one that I developed for the book Preaching in the Purple Zone. And it came out of my work with a process of civil discourse called deliberative dialogue. And in deliberative dialogue, you're bringing people together from different walks of life, different ages, different political orientations, but like as much diversity as you can. And you are setting some ground rules for how we'll talk respectfully to each other. Um, but we are, first of all, going to share, how does this issue affect us? So we're not going to just go with, Fox News or MSNBC, I guess it's called MS Now, talking points, that we're really like, how is this affecting you, the people that you know? What is your skin in the game? And then we look at three different approaches to the issue using an issue guide. I usually use the National Issues Forum Institute. They have some great nonpartisan issue guides, and this guides the conversation so that it's not this position versus this position, and we're going to debate on which one is right. We take the three different approaches and we say, what are the pros and the cons of these different approaches? And it helps to develop critical thinking skills so that people might say, well, I agree with this, but I do see there are some downsides. Or I don't agree with this approach, but I do see that there could be some benefits this way. So once you've come through this process, then you identify what are the values that we are hearing amongst ourselves that are important to us, and where might be God be calling us to respond to this issue given where we're coming from and what our values are. So on either end of this process of the deliberative dialogue, what I proposed was a sermon that I call a prophetic invitation to dialogue that introduces the topic and says, here, here's where the Bible gives us some insight. Here's where we get some insight from whatever science or, you know, like these are some things, but we need to talk about this. And we're going to have this deliberative dialogue. We go through this process. And then the follow-up sermon is what I call the communal prophetic discernment sermon. So this is the pastor saying, here's what we talked about. Here's what we heard. Here's how the Spirit was moving among us. And here's what we're going to do next. There might be a forum, or we might do a letter writing campaign, or we might bring in a panel discussion, or whatever we decide to do. And then it's this ongoing process. And we've now tested this with congregations and pastors through a grant through the Wabash Center through Preaching and Learning. And we found that this really makes a difference for the capacity of a congregation to be able to talk about these difficult social issues in a way that builds community and builds discernment and builds the muscles for this work, rather than like fight, flight, or freeze. Like, oh, we can't talk about this because it's going to mean that people are going to leave, or they're going to take their money, or I'm going to lose my job. It's building this capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the book, you talk about a very specific unforced error that even well-intentioned, more progressive preachers make, namely having a very clear, aggressively articulated law pertaining to social and identitarian ethics, and a rather deflated, muted, or absent gospel. Um, and so I wonder if you could help us diagnose that problem and like what's, having done all the interviews, like why is that such a common feature today in kind of more progressive Christian life? Because uh, if you read Niebuhr, Tillich, MLK sermons, that was not their problem. And no one, like, and all three of them are like tell everyone Christian socialist, right? But apparently, just like slightly left of center mainline Protestants have a harder time with the gospel in an American context than theologian preachers that are socialists. And it's becoming a bigger problem. So that's why that part of the book really stuck out as an unforced error.
So I've done a lot of unforced errors. Can you be more specific about which one I'm talking about there?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's that sense where you go, okay, I have to be prophetic on this, and then you go dropping down the law and leave it. And I see it as a symptom of it's kind of like a lot of progressive Christians have taken these beautiful flowers of a faith-seeking, flourishing, and justice, and then they cut it, and we've set it kind of culturally in water, and it ultimately is going to die. So, like, if you remove the theological foundations, the image of God in every person, the call to love your enemies, even if they're in the other political party, the reality of grace and possibility of redemption, then the ethics, the law, the proclamation becomes unstable, and all of a sudden, right, being a prophetic turns into call out culture with no forgiveness, or a hierarchy of victimhood without reconciliation, or relentless judgment, no mercy, that kind of cancel culture energy.
Yeah.
And then you wonder why people are repulsed to it.
Right. And so when people say, "Oh, I don't talk about politics in the pulpit," that's what they have in mind. They have in mind, or they don't want to hear politics in the pulpit. They don't want to be scolded. They don't want to be a scolder.
Yeah.
They don't want to be seen as putting out a Jeremiad every week. That gets that all people do is feel, okay, I am a terrible person, and the world is terrible, and there's no hope. So I guess I'll just go watch Netflix. Instead, in addition to naming the brokenness, which we need to do, and I'm Lutheran. So when we think about the law, we think about it as it's a mirror to hold up to
Yeah.
seeing us as we really are, as opposed to the hammer that just like hits people over the head and um, does nothing to build that relationship. Now, some preachers are even hesitant to hold up the mirror because seeing the truth about who we are and our attitudes and our fragility and the way we hurt others, even that can feel like a hammer, right? Because there is so much brokenness right now. And in many ways, we live in a system where we have no choice but to be complicit with certain things that are happening, and that's really hard to take in. And so rather than to deal, like, to name it, we're just going to ignore it. But what that does is it sends the message that the church is a place that we can't have those conversations, that we don't have that capacity, or that God doesn't care about it. Um, like, we don't want to go to those extremes. So when we are naming this brokenness, that brings us to the foot of the cross, so that we can say, okay, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where the reconciliation of God meets us in the place that we don't have the capacity to do this for ourselves. And then to point to examples of where we see this happening in the world, where there is a crack in the system, where there is that light coming through, where there has been grace, where there has been transformation. Doesn't have to be like huge, the skies open up and the head and the angels sing. It can be, but it's often these small parable like fissures that show us, okay, God's still at work. I'm being called to participate in this work. We as a congregation are, and we can do this together. And when we see this happening, when we experience this, it is incredible. Like, that is a way to neutralize the heavy, soul-sucking quicksand of the law that says there's nothing we can do. God is already doing something. We get to participate in this. So here's an opportunity for us to live into what it means to be the community of God. Let's do this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, one of the questions that came in different variations is how you respond to our peers doing giant social media call outs towards their other peers that goes something like, if your pastor didn't preach about X this Sunday,
Yeah.
they suck. And which, okay, I get it if you're not a preacher saying something like that and it's an issue that's like of intrinsic well-being to you. Like, I can understand where it comes from. Even if, and I just think they just don't understand what preachers are doing. But the idea, right, that you could watch someone else's sermon and then actually have the perspective to know how to judge it in some like significant way. Like, obviously, if they're like, oh, segregation, great idea, we should bomb people, like, there are obvious things. But
Yeah.
what raising a topic or preaching at it prophetically and things look like to another congregation really involves getting to know the congregation. It's
Yes.
so much that the church I worked at the longest in LA, we had two different services and my sermons were different.
Yeah.
And I remember when they forgot to record the late service, that they put the early service audio on the one that was sent to all the homebound members. And the early service, which is surprisingly bigger, younger, and more vibrant, also the archetype of what you think of a West Coast UCC church is. So Trip is clear, and it is much more of a robust style.
Yes.
But the second service, much more invitational.
Yeah.
And it was just funny. The moment they didn't record the late one and they used the early one, I got emails from the same people that love my sermons normally going, what happened? And I just think to myself, I really hope this person doesn't Google me and realize there's a lot of me on the internet without
Yeah.
pastoral contextualization.
Right,
But
right,
anyway,
right,
the
right.
call out bit, that's what, sorry for
Yeah.
my that turned it into a confessional here.
No, no. Well, one of the things that I want to remind pastors and congregants of is that the uh, the preaching event is not the be all and end all. What we're looking for are um, the patterns of preaching over time. So, yeah, and yes, there are times that I think require us to put whatever sermon we had been working on aside and address this really important thing. Um, but if we are not ready for that because there were 3 funerals this week and the youth retreat, and I do not have time to change my sermon, even though this horrible thing happened that needs the church's attention. Um, to say during the announcements, I want to acknowledge that this has happened in the world. Um, I'm going to be addressing this in the future, not today, but I want you to know it's coming. That it's that we're listening, we're paying attention to this because we know you are too, and so stay tuned. So I think that's okay to do. However, if the pattern of the preacher is to just not engage these issues in the using the rationalization of unity
Yeah.
or protecting the family or not ruffling the feathers of the big donors, then we have to have a really serious conversation about, um, is this the right place for you? What needs to be put in place so that you can feel that the muzzle comes off and you feel free and not threatened to have to preach to this. So it's, I would say, look at the patterns rather than the one-time events.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's important. And one of the new features of our current administration is I have no interest in rewriting my sermon every week just because he sucks at his job so bad. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah.
hopefully
Yeah.
that's a time bound.
And I
Just
will say, there have been many times when pastors have shared with me that if they follow the Revised Common Lectionary, that it's weird how the text that just happened to have been chosen
yeah,
decades ago perfectly align with a decision or an event that has happened. And how can you not say something because the text is speaking directly to it?
yeah.
It's
Don't at
it's
least don't mute
eerie.
the text.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not saying to shoehorn in something, and to make the text say what it doesn't say. That's eisegesis. But there are ways that we can say, okay, the values that we see here articulated in this text do apply to this situation, even if the Bible doesn't talk about climate change or gun control. So it's not in the Bible, so we shouldn't preach about it. Well, violence was in the Bible, and how we decide how we distribute resources, it's all throughout the Bible. So thinking in those general terms can help us frame these sermons.
Hmm. All right. Here's a question from James, who said, "My congregation will engage with personal sin talk all day long.
Mhm.
The moment I talk about systems, structures that harm people, eyes glaze over or people get defensive. So how do I begin to open that up?"
Yeah. Um, I would say make the system personal. Share a story of how this systemic issue has affected somebody in the community. Now, we want to be really careful and clear that we are not outing people, that we are not shaming people, that if we're going to share somebody's story, we either get permission from them or we change enough of the details that nobody could determine that this is the person that you're talking about. um, but to say that's how this system, this has affected this one family that maybe comes to our food pantry, or that in our church summer camp this came up. So personalize the system. At the same time, take the biblical stories and help people understand how these stories reflect the system that was in place. So whether it was the Roman Empire and, the imperial oppression that was like, that's always in the background. These are um, these are texts about people who are moving from one place to another. So they're immigrants, or they're dealing with very oppressive, violent regimes, whether they're in exile with the Israelites are in Babylon, or they're dealing with the Roman Empire. That's always in the background. So help people understand that um, this thing that's happening in the background of the text directly influences what we're seeing in this parable or this story or this letter. So you got to come from top down and bottom up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Um, so I got one more question from the book, and then we can try to do a few of the pastor questions to wrap up. One of the places in the book where I was like, "Ooh, that's spicy," is when you suggested that if someone comes to you and they got an issue, um, don't do what is the archetype move of overeducated mainline Protestant clergy, which is to explain reason and facts to them.
Yes,
You
yes, yes,
actually
yes, yes.
suggest someone that may be BCCing the rest of the congregation to end our employment, that we thank them first.
Yes.
I finished reading after you said that, but I just want you to kind of unpack that.
Right, right. Um, yeah. So the initial response when a human being feels like it's being attacked is to go on defensive, and this takes a lot of practice, I will say. But if we can disarm that defensiveness and see this as an opportunity to listen and build relationship, it's going to go a long way towards sustaining you in ministry and allowing you to do the kind of preaching and prophetic work that you want to do. So and I came to this realization to say thank you after having hit my head against the wall with, let me explain to you why you're wrong about what you said. To be like defensive like this, because that just then it's just ratcheting up the energy and we can't get anywhere with that. So just to simply say, Trip, I just want to thank you, first of all, for being honest with me that you were concerned about this. You could have gone and complained about me to other people, or you could have sent me an anonymous note and I would never have known who it was from and I couldn't have
Yeah,
engaged in this conversation with you. Or you could have like stood up in the congregation and like started a brouhaha and like, but you came to me, and what you've done is actually really biblical, because Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, if you have a problem with somebody, go to them first and have a conversation. And so I want to thank you for having this conversation with me. Now let's figure out how we can do this in a really constructive way. So if they're coming at you in the handshaking line after church, that is not the time to engage, but to say, look, shoot me an email. Let's find a place to have coffee and talk about this. Or, um, I'm happy to go for a walk in the park with you and let's walk and talk together. I love walk and talks. Walk and talks are great because we're both going in the same direction. We're not at each other, but we're working this out. Walk and talks are great. Um, and then once you've are in that situation where you're not at each other and you're really listening, do the things that I mentioned before. How did you come to oh wait, actually the first thing is to say, not to start with the intellectual, but to say, when you heard this sermon, how did it make you feel? What emotions came up for you? And whether they say, well, I was angry or I was concerned or it really hurt. Oh, wow. We need to hear that. And that's going to be hard to hear as a pastor because we never want to hurt somebody through our words. Um, but to say, okay, thank you for sharing that. And they're not right or wrong about that. How they feel is how they feel. And then unpack that. Okay, where's that coming from? What did I say? What did I do? What was going on for you? help them tell their story about what the experience was like. And I will tell you, one time, I had a conversation with somebody who came up to me and said, I, your sermon is straight out of Obama's talking points. And I was like, oh, wow, let's have a conversation about this. And so we were talking, and he was like, just going at me, going at me, going at me. And I was like, so it sounds to me like Obama really rubs you the wrong way. Yes, yes, he does. I said, who does Obama remind you of? My father. Oh, now we're getting somewhere. So it really wasn't about me at all. It really wasn't even about President Obama. It was about something else that we can now have a pastoral conversation about.
Yeah.
And it's not like he turned around and like, oh, the everything changed, but we were able to have a conversation that allowed him to be human and to be vulnerable, and for me not to shut him down, and for us to find a way forward.
Yeah. All right. Can we do two more questions?
Sure.
All right. Let's do Carol's, because I don't want to answer this one from you get to. I gave a sermon I believed in, and the fallout was severe. It shook my confidence badly. I'm still not sure I've recovered. What do you say to clergy who've been through that and are trying to find their footing again?
Oh, Carol, first of all, thank you for being honest about this. Um, you're not the only one who's had this happen to them. It's happened to me. It's happened to my students. It happened to colleagues. But for you to just come right out and say this, I'm with you. I'm feeling that. I'm feeling that in my bones. So everybody's different on how they process things. I will share for you what's been helpful for me and what has been helpful for students that I've worked through on this. First of all, um, find someone that you trust that can help you process through what happened, that will read the sermon for you or watch the video and just initially give you some impressions, and not in a way that's going to feel judgmental, but is like diplomatic, but just honest, like somebody that cares about you and can help you sort of feel like what happened here. And if it was like the way you came off or a certain word that you used, like there was some time when I used a word in a sermon that I didn't realize was a hidden landmine in the congregation. And so when I processed the sermon with, we happen to have a really good human relations committee that I really trusted. And I was like, I don't know what happened here, but the blowback was severe and I need to process this. And they're like, oh, well, you said this and you don't know that the history of the congregation is involving this. I was like, oh, okay, so it wasn't me. I stepped in something I didn't know was there. And then I knew how to proceed with the person and like again have a pastoral conversation. Um, or it might have been like, Leah, your tone is just really judgmental here. And I'd like that's just the way it's coming off to me. And I'm like, okay, so why am I having such a why am I coming off so strong here? What's going on for me? So then I can think about what's happening on my end. But if those things have been worked through and it's still like there's so much blowback that you got to figure like, can I even stay here? Then you need to have probably some larger conversations about, is this the right place for me? Are there some dynamics going on in the congregation that they need to work through? And maybe I'm not the person to work through that with them. So have that initial conversation with somebody that you trust first. Maybe it's your counselor, maybe it's a mentor, like whoever, to work through that initial level of things to help you figure out where to go from there. I would encourage you not to let this one sermon derail you from your calling, because my sense is you're faithful, you've done the work, you're trying to do this in a way that is effective, and there are probably some things that you weren't aware of that you can work on, and it's probably fixable. maybe not short term, but long term. And if it's not, even that is a way for you to discern, where am I being called to from here?
That's really helpful. All right. We'll go with Joel's question for the last question. Joel says, I feel like seminary prepared me to preach in a congregation that doesn't really exist anymore.
Ooh,
The tools I was given feel inadequate for the moment we're actually in. Do other clergy feel that way, and what do we do about it?
wow. Wow. Joel. Yeah. Okay. As a seminary professor, I'm hearing this question like go right through me. And as a seminary student of, 25-ish years ago, um, I'm hearing this as well. Um, I think this is where um, conversations with fellow clergy can be helpful, to get a sense of, all right, I think there's like a whole Facebook page on things they didn't teach us in seminary. Um, like, for example, when I went through, I was not taught how to really deal with the kind of political conflict that we're dealing with now. That just was not on the radar. I was taught how to deal with like family systems theory, but Christian nationalism wasn't even on the radar. Like, that is a fairly, I mean, it's always been in American history, but the way it's manifesting itself now, unless you're in seminary now and there are courses that are deliberately designed with this in mind, you're not prepared for this. So there are some books that I can recommend, um, specifically with Christian nationalism, because maybe this isn't what you're talking about, but I'm having a sense that maybe it is. There's a great book called The Psychology of Christian Nationalism by Pamela Cooper White that helps us understand, like, what is going on here? What is the phenomena that we're dealing with? Andrew Whitehead has a lot of books on Christian nationalism to help us understand, like, what's going on historically, what's going on sociologically. Um, so those, like, draw on the resources of people who are doing the research on what congregations are like right now, because this is shaping our congregations. And seminaries um, can sometimes pivot, but it takes a lot to get a new course through and to respond to the congregation as we see it now. That takes a while. So avail yourself to people who are doing this research and doing this work. Talk with other clergy, talk with people that you trust, and think about, okay, how do I minister to the congregation we have instead of the congregation we were trained for?
Mhm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. It's always nice to outsource difficult questions to a professional.
These are great questions. Oh my gosh.
Um, and yeah, which, by the way, clergy listening, if you have more questions, you should send them. I can try to talk Leah into hanging out again. You want to show them the book one more time for those
Yes, here it
watching?
is.
And
Preaching and Social Issues, Tools and Tactics for Empowering Your Prophetic Voice, available wherever books are sold.
yes, we'll have info about it on the post with this once it comes out. So yeah, and thank you all of you that joined up live. This has been fun.
Can I add one more thing, Trip?
Yeah.
I do write about this on a weekly basis, usually in my blog, Eco Preacher, on Pathos. So I show how a lot of these tools can be applied to texts, to situations. Um, so Eco Preacher on Pathos.
hmm Oh, weird question. Uh, I had a couple emails where people said, "Well, where do mainline Protestant preachers go if there's not going to have a homiletics festival this year?"
Oh,
I mean, the correct answer is Theology Beer Camp, but I understand if you want to hang out with your peers.
um, yeah. So I will say that for young preachers, there is a new event coming up called Festival of Young Preachers. It's coming up on May 2nd,
What now?
in
What's young
Atlanta.
here? Is this mainline young?
16 to 30.
Okay.
16 to 30. Um, if you Google Festival of Young Preachers, I just learned about this, um, but Joseph Howard is heading this up. So this is a great place for those of you who are in that 16 to 30 age range. If you're looking for a festival, that is the place for you. And then for others who are older than that or younger, I will let you know that I head up a program called the Eco Preacher Cohort through a grant for the Compelling Preaching for a Climate Change World. And we are starting a new cohort in September for those who want to think about how can I address climate change and environmental issues. That is a great way to connect with preachers who are thinking about environmental issues, but related social issues as well, because climate change connects to all of them. So you can look for the Eco Preacher Cohort and fill out an interest form, and we would love to have you join us in the fall.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And
thank you, Trip.
we'll look